So, hello guys. I hope you're all doing well. Welcome to our fourth module for our Multgen class. This is entitled Understanding Issues on Gender and Multiculturalism. So, this content is quite a handful, and I really wish that we would have a face to face discussion on this, but we are in the situation. So, let's just make most of our online platform and let's go. So the first topic under this module is intersectionality. So intersectionality is a very important framework that we need to know about in this class because that is going to be one of the main pillars of the advocacy program that you'll be working on. So what is intersectionality? So intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. And she said that gender inequality and patriarchy intersect with other systems of oppression, like, for instance, race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, which we understand is made up of three things, which are education, occupation, and income. And then we also have sexuality and other forms of social identities. And the intersections of these then contribute to unique experiences of oppression and privilege. So as we go along, we'll be able to uncover what that specific statement means. So intersectionality argues that inequities are the outcome of intersections of different social locations, power relations, and experiences. These intersections are dynamic and changing over time. So, for instance, we do understand that females in general are in a disadvantaged position in a patriarchal society. But when you compare the experiences of oppression of an educated female compared to someone who did not finish schooling or did not have any form of schooling, you would see that the oppression experiences of these two individuals would be different because of the two sets of oppressions that the other person is exposed to. And intersectionality further argues that the particular experience of intersecting discriminations is unique and not simply the sum of the different discriminations. So, for example, we have three people. The first person is female, the second person is not educated, and the third person is both female and not educated. The discriminatory experience of the third person is not merely summing up the discriminatory experiences of the first person who's female and the second person who's uneducated, but it really, when you understand it, it's kind of multiplying those discriminations into something more unique that cannot be experienced by the first two persons. So therefore, in any political movement such as feminism, which we'll be discussing later in this module, must tackle all forms of discrimination and oppression, whether based on gender, race, class, and so on. So a more commendable form of feminist movements would be not just those that address or call out issues that affects women, but also understands that other types of inequalities such as racial inequalities and sexuality inequalities can also further compound on the experiences of women. So, putting all those things together, here is your summary of basic concepts and principles of intersectionality. First, that identities of people are complex and intersecting, and that each and every person who has different types of intersecting identities have substantially different experiences, and therefore it is very important that we make any sort of political movements that tackle all types or all structures of oppression, not just a specific issue. So no single issue movement would be very effective. There should always be an invitation to have a more intersectional perspective in the way we try to address issues, especially in terms of gender issues. So one of the terminal goals of this Multgen course is to be able to answer this question: how can intersectionality be used to address all forms of marginalization? So here's one. So first is to be able to do a really in-depth and thorough power analysis. So again, we understand that intersectional constellations, instead of just hierarchies, we talk about constellations of identities and experiences should inform political agendas and not just hierarchical issues in terms of gender. We always have to think that gender, race, sexuality, these things always interact in every living individual. And therefore, the choices that different groups make are based on the power asymmetries that they experience. So we understand that white females would have a different need compared to black females, compared to black females who's also lesbian, compared to a black female who's also a lesbian and also is experiencing some sort of sickness or disabilities. Their needs, while they're all the same females, their needs are different, their experiences are different for every introduction of social vulnerability within their multicultural identity. And also, intersectionality invites us to make politicized transformative movements, which first embraces a rights-based approach. So what does that mean? So it means that we understand that everyone is entitled to human rights, basic human rights, based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And therefore, when we say that something is a right, it is a duty of everyone, especially the state, to provide this right to us, to protect that right. So when we say that everybody has a right to life, or everybody has a right to health, or everybody has a right to education, despite your gender, despite your sex, despite your ability, despite your religious background, the state must be able to provide you that. And that is why this is good for intersectionality, because a rights-based approach makes sure that everyone, despite their position in that intersectional constellation of social identities, they get to receive the things that can make them have a good life, to make them survive this world. So that's why rights-based approach is so important in intersectionality. Another important principle in intersectionality is social justice. Means that equality is not just giving the same thing to everyone without regard to their social identity. We have to understand that social safety nets must be present, meaning that those who have less must be given more by society, by the state. So those who have some form of vulnerability, those who experience discrimination, those who have social handicaps because of their race, cultural background, religious background, gender, or sexuality, must be given more by the government, because it's a little bit harder for them to get through life because of that, that structural discrimination that they already are experiencing. And that's social justice, to give social safety nets, to make sure that everyone will have an equal chance, by giving more to those who have inherently less. And the end goal of this is to be able to transform society, because society as we know it has a lot of oppressive structures. And in order for us to solve an issue of a specific group, we understand that intersectional approaches must mean that we also have to address all types of discrimination, all types of vulnerability. And if we want to do that, we have to transform our current status quo. Another important thing when we do intersectional analysis is context. It means understanding and tackling of discriminations that should be linked to the wider social, political, economic, and legal environment in which they appear. So we understand that there are larger social structures that normalize and institutionalize these oppressions further. Like, for example, we know capitalism. Capitalism is all about productivity. And we understand that there is a general understanding that those who aren't male, white, cis are considered to be less productive in society, less likable, and less saleable in society. Or using femininity as a way to be able to gain more money, as we see in a lot of feminine products, gendered products that are totally unnecessary, but because it furthers consumerism. We do it anyway, even if it sexually objectifies females. So that's really bad. And of course, patriarchy. What else can I say? We've discussed patriarchy and misogyny as a very harmful practice, not only against females, but also, non-heterosexual identities and trans communities. And you might think, what does climate change have to do with oppression of gender minorities and sexual minorities? Because when you think about climate change, it's something that's encompassing. It's something that affects everyone in the globe, despite your social position. But it really is something that's affecting these minorities, because we understand that if climate change denial continues and nothing is done to halt climate change, then the first people who gets impacted by climate change issues are those who are poor, those who are impoverished. And when you look at society, women and sexual minorities are the first people in line in poverty. So therefore, females and sexual minorities are more likely to be affected by climate change compared to their male heterosexual counterparts. Another would be, of course, fundamentalism, a fundamentalist ideology, traditionalist, very much grounded on religious beliefs. And we understand how societies that are so very grounded on religion have disenfranchised women. Like, for example, in the Philippines, because of being a Catholic country, it took so much time before we get the Reproductive Health Act enacted. And until now, we still don't have a divorce law. Until now, we still don't have a SOGI law. Until now, we don't have same-sex marriage. And it's because of the foothold of fundamental ideologies like this. And it's not just Catholic ideologies, but also other religious and fundamentalist ideologies, like Muslim ideologies also can introduce some sort of discrimination to women, etc., etc. And another very important thing that intersectionality asserts is that knowledge about interwoven oppressions is not enough. You have to resist. You have to do some form of activism. You have to take your findings to the streets. This is one of the critiques that has been given to academicians who do gender studies, who do racial studies, who do research on sexual minorities and how discrimination happens, blah blah blah, so on and so forth. But they just remain as academic papers. They just get printed in research journals, but it doesn't really make any form of transformative change in society. So intersectionality, just like any form of feminism, just like any form of critical and radical movement, you have to take your findings to the streets. You have to make people know what are the findings of your analysis, how people get oppressed. You have to take it to people who can actually change policy. You have to do lobbying. You have to make advocacy. That's the reason why you're creating advocacy projects. It's because knowledge building is not enough. You have to make movements. So we need to use that knowledge to work towards building appropriate forms of resistance to those oppressions. And that is the reason why in your advocacy project, it's not just enough that you give me like the related literature for the content of your advocacy. It's also important for you to justify the appropriateness of your medium, because we have to make sure that you're reaching the right people that you're supposed to reach so that you can make the transformation that's necessary to be able to address that oppression. And therefore, when you join these resistance movements, when you join these advocacy programs, you also get to build alliances because it's intersectional. You get to also work with other people who work in other types of inequalities and oppressions, like, for example, racial issues, ethnic issues, religious issues, etc., etc. So I don't know if you've attended a Pride March before, but if you look at the messaging there, it's not just about issues in relation to sexual minorities, like same-sex marriage, anti-discrimination messages for sexual minorities and trans individuals, but also you would see placards saying that we need to take care of our farmers, that we need to stop corruption in government. Because again, we understand that in order for us to have good welfare for specific gender and sexual minorities, we have to address other types of minorities. And because we understand in intersectionality that each person's experience of oppression is unique based on where you are in the intersectional constellation, it is also good to make use of experience and knowledge as a vantage point for any type of advocacy, for any type of oppressed groups. So participatory approaches is very important, meaning that we provide the platform of advocacy to people who actually experience the oppression. So if we are in privilege, we shouldn't be the first persons talking about the oppression of other people. And we need to bank on their personal experiences and welcome diversity of worldviews and knowledge, because again, multiculturalism is also very much highly connected with intersectionality, because again, we deal with a lot of social identities there. Remember multicultural self? So there you go. Another thing that's very important, since we're talking about the use of personal experiences in terms of laying out our advocacy, is the practice of reflexivity. What does reflexivity mean? It means that we must consider our own social positions in society, identities, and relationships, and how these might shape our perspective and the outcome of our analysis. So when you try doing your multicultural self again, you ask, how does each identity place me in this intersectional constellation? How does the addition of a new form of vulnerable identity found in my multicultural self, placing me in a different type of oppression as other people who don't have that type of exposure to a certain vulnerable social identity. At the same time, we also don't just talk about our own vulnerabilities. We also talk about our positions that make us better off in society. And we go to that very important phrase that gets thrown a lot in woke Twitter, and that is, check your privilege. So in short, the practice of reflexivity for people who are in better spaces, in better spaces in that social sphere, is checking one's privilege. So I know you have a working definition of what privilege is, but the nerd definition of privilege is the unearned access to resources or social power. So in short, if you were born in an upper class, if you were born male, if you are born with a healthy body without any genetic anomaly, or if you are heterosexual, if you're cis, these are unearned access to social power and resources. And these are readily available to some people because you were a member of a social group, because you were born into or you were placed into a social group that is not a minority. You were placed in a dominant group. An advantage or immunity granted to or enjoyed by one societal group above and beyond the common advantage of all other groups. And most of the time, privilege is often invisible to people who have it, And that's the reason why reflexivity is so important. And checking one's privilege is quite difficult, because when you're born with it and you're socialized with it, it gets normalized in you. And therefore, it's so hard to pick it out, to pick it up, and tease it apart, to parse it. It's kind of difficult. And here are just some of the social groups that have some sort of unearned privileges. Of course, in the Philippines, we have Catholic or Christian privilege. We understand that society, the Philippine society, and most of its policies are still highly grounded in the Catholic faith. And therefore, if you are a practicing Catholic compared to someone who's an atheist or an agnostic, then things must be going well for you. Next is class privilege. Of course, especially for upper class, which most of us in class might be in. We understand that, there are a lot of privilege of being in an upper class, and some of the resources that we have of being upper class is something that we might have unearned even, because we were born in a rich family, or we were born in a rich, dynasty, and it's really a privilege because we get to have good healthcare access. We have good access to education. For instance, in this COVID-19 experience, we understand that richer people are more likely going to survive this pandemic more than poor people do, because they have access to good medical facilities, they have access to resources during the quarantine period compared to their middle class and lower class counterparts. And of course, trade privilege, it's always a privilege to have your love unquestioned, to have your privileges and benefits extended to a loved one, because you can get married in a certain state that only allows for heterosexual love to be, placed under civil union. So that must be nice. Okay. And of course, male privilege. In a very patriarchal society, there are more opportunities available for males compared to females in a patriarchal society. Maybe not as oppressive in the Philippines as in other countries, but still you can see some gender disparities in terms of opportunities. And then we also have white privilege. So those European descent people, those who were born in Europe and in the Americas, and if you are there, if you have Caucasian features, you are most likely going to have more opportunities compared to racial and ethnic minorities. And of course, adult privileges, because of older generations, they have more seats in politics, so they have more power in terms of making changes in society. They have more agency to do that, and they have more control over their younger generational counterparts. And of course, able-bodied privilege. If you don't have any disability, then life would be so much better for you. You have more employment opportunities. You have lesser, bills to worry, because you don't have any type of disability that can hinder you from getting a normal job. No, that's why it's so important for companies to have more inclusive policies, to have disability quotas, etc. And of course, cis privilege, not having to explain your gender identity to someone, is a privilege also that someone who's trans would not be able to experience, or would have a hard time experiencing that type of acceptance, and that type of wealth of opportunity might not be present to him. So that's your intersectionality class for you. I will be also uploading some other videos from YouTube that will be able to make you reflect more, be more reflexive, and I hope to see you soon. And we'll have the next part probably next week. So see you by then.